It started on a quiet evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with silence, and the world outside the windows seems frozen in time. My name is Evelyn, and I never thought my life would take the turn it did. I had always been the dependable one, the steady presence in the lives of those around me. But that evening something shifted, something I couldn't quite put into words. The house was empty, as it often was these days. My husband, Daniel, had been traveling more frequently for work. He'd leave early Monday mornings and return late Friday nights, sometimes even later if his meetings ran over. Our son Caleb had just turned 18 and was in his first year of college. Though he still lived at home, his life was already filling with friends, late-night study sessions, and the kind of freedom that comes with youth. I didn't mind. I wanted him to experience life fully, to have the opportunities one never had. But that evening, as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty glass of wine on the counter, I felt it again, that hollow ache in my chest. Loneliness. It had crept into my life so quietly that I hadn't even noticed it at first. But now it was impossible to ignore. It was there in the empty chairs at the dining table, the cold side of the bed, the silence that filled the house when no one was around. I sighed and turned off the kitchen light, carrying my glass of wine to the living room. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. I sank into the couch, pulling a blanket over my legs. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching. It was just background noise, something to fill the silence. Then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting Caleb home until much later. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden floor above me. "Caleb?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. There was no response. I set my glass down and stood, my pulse quickening. Maybe he'd come home early and didn't want to disturb me. Or maybe my mind started racing with irrational thoughts. I shook my head, trying to dismiss them. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from the crack under Caleb's bedroom door. I hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. "Caleb, are you home?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open slightly, and there he was, sitting on the edge of his bed, his head down, his hands clasped together. He looked up at me. His eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Sadness? Anger? "Mom," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know you'd be. I frowned, stepping into the room. "Caleb, what's going on? Are you okay?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I came home early. I thought you'd be asleep by now." I crossed my arms, concern etched on my face. "You're scaring me. Did something happen?" He shook his head quickly. No, it's nothing like that. I saw you downstairs earlier. You didn't see me, but I saw you." I blinked, confused. "You saw me? What do you mean?" Caleb stood and started pacing the room, his movements agitated. "I saw you sitting there on the couch. You looked, I don't know, lost. I've never seen you like that before." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I hadn't realized anyone was watching me. I hadn't realized how transparent my emotions had become. "I'm sorry," he continued, stopping to look at me. "I didn't mean to spy on you or anything. I don't know. I didn't know how to approach you." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Caleb, I'm fine. Really. You don't need to worry about me." "But I do worry," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You've been different lately. Ever since Dad started traveling more, you've been distant. Like you're here, but you're not really here." His words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much my loneliness had affected him. I thought I'd been hiding it well, but clearly I hadn't. "I'm sorry," I said softly, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "I didn't mean for you to see that. I didn't mean for you to worry." Caleb sat down beside me, his shoulders slumping. "I just hate seeing you like this. You deserve to be happy, Mom." I smiled faintly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I am happy, Caleb. I have you and your dad. I have a good life. Sometimes I just get caught up in my own thoughts, that's all." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. If you ever want to talk, I'm here, okay? I know I'm just a kid, but I can listen. I laughed softly, ruffling his hair. You're not a kid anymore, Caleb. And thank you. That means a lot. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Eventually he stood and stretched. I should probably get some sleep. Got an early class tomorrow. I nodded, standing as well. Good night, sweetheart. And thank you. He smiled faintly. Good night, Mom. As I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Caleb had seen a side of me I'd tried to keep hidden, and while it was uncomfortable, it also felt freeing. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely alone. The days that followed felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Caleb's words lingered in my mind, replaying over and over like a song stuck on repeat. Asterisk, you've been distant. You deserve to be happy. Asterisk, I hadn't realized how much my emotions had seeped into the fabric of our home, how visible my struggles had become to him. It was unnerving in a way. To know that my son, my baby boy who still left his laundry on the floor and forgot to take out the trash, was now old enough to see through me. I tried to push it aside to focus on my routines. The house was always quieter during the weekdays. Daniel was gone as usual, and Caleb spent most of his time at school or with friends. I busied myself with chores, errands, and the occasional book, but the silence was always there, like a shadow that followed me from room to room. By Wednesday evening I was starting to feel restless. The hours stretched endlessly before me, the monotony of my days weighing me down. I decided to distract myself by baking, something I hadn't done in a while. I pulled out my old recipe book, the one with the tattered edges and stains from years of use, and flipped to a page I hadn't touched in ages: chocolate chip cookies. As I mixed the ingredients, the familiar motions brought a sense of comfort. The smell of vanilla and melted butter filled the kitchen, and for a moment I felt lighter. It was a small thing, but it was enough to keep my mind occupied. Just as I was placing the first tray in the oven, I heard the front door open. Caleb's voice echoed through the hallway. Mom? I'm home. I glanced at the clock. It was earlier than I expected. In the kitchen, I called back. A moment later, Caleb appeared in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His hair was messy and he looked tired, but there was a faint smile on his face. What's all this? He asked, nodding toward the counter where bowls, measuring cups, and ingredients were scattered. Cookies, I said simply, wiping my hands on a towel. I thought it might be nice to have something sweet around the house. He raised an eyebrow. You haven't baked in forever. What's the occasion? I shrugged, trying to play it off.
No cachen.
Just felt like it. Caleb dropped his bag by the door and walked over to the counter, picking up a stray chocolate chip and popping it into his mouth. You feeling okay? I gave him a pointed look. Why does everyone keep asking me that? He held up his hands in mock surrender. Okay. I'm just saying, it's a little out of the ordinary, but I'm not complaining. I love your cookies. I smiled despite myself. Well, you'll have to wait a bit. They're still baking. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I cleaned up. So, what have you been up to today? I hesitated for a moment, realizing how dull my answer would sound. Oh, the usual. Laundry, groceries, a little reading. Caleb frowned. Do you ever do anything for yourself? Like something fun? I laughed softly. What do you mean? Baking is fun. He shook his head. No, I mean, like, do you ever go out? See friends? Do something that's just for you. The question caught me off guard. I paused, the dish towel in my hands. I don't know. I guess I haven't really thought about it. You should, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I wanted to brush it off, to tell him that I didn't need anything more than what I already had. But the truth was, his question struck a nerve. When was the last time I'd done something just for me? When was the last time I'd felt truly alive, outside of my roles as a wife and mother? I'll think about it, I said finally, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Caleb seemed satisfied with that answer. He grabbed a glass of water and headed toward the living room. Let me know when the cookies are ready, he called over his shoulder. I watched him go. a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. He was right, of course. I had spent so much of my life taking care of others that I'd forgotten how to take care of myself. But where would I even start? That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the living room, the plate of freshly baked cookies untouched on the coffee table. The TV was on, but I wasn't paying attention. My thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to when I was younger. I used to have dreams, big dreams. I wanted to travel, to write, to experience the world in all its messy, unpredictable glory. But life had a way of steering me in a different direction. I met Daniel, we got married, and then Caleb came along. I wouldn't trade any of it for the world, but somewhere along the way, I'd lost sight of the person I used to be. I sighed, leaning back against the couch. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe it was time to rediscover that part of myself. The next day, I decided to take a small step. After dropping Caleb off at school, I drove to a nearby park. It was a beautiful day. The kind where the sun filters through the trees and the air smells like fresh grass. I found a quiet bench near the pond and sat down, letting the peacefulness of the surroundings wash over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to just be. No chores, no errands, no responsibilities, just me and my thoughts. I pulled out a notebook from my bag, one I hadn't touched in years. The pages were blank, waiting to be filled. I hesitated for a moment before putting pen to paper. Asterisk, who am I, outside of being a wife and mother? Asterisk. The question stared back at me, stark and unanswerable. But instead of feeling discouraged, I felt curious. Maybe I didn't have the answer yet, but I could start looking for it. As I sat there, the sound of birds chirping and the gentle ripple of the water in the background, I felt something shift inside me. It was small, barely noticeable. But it was there. A spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. When I picked Caleb up later that afternoon, he noticed the change immediately. "You're smiling," he said. A note of surprise in his voice. "Am I not allowed to smile?" I teased, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He grinned. "Of course you are. It's just nice to see." I didn't tell him about the park or the notebook. Not yet. It felt too personal, too new to share. But as we drove home, I couldn't help but feel grateful for him. For his questions, his concern, his quiet encouragement. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Something just for me. The days rolled on and slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself that I thought had been lost forever. It wasn't easy, of course. There were moments of doubt. Moments when I felt selfish for even entertaining the idea of doing things for myself. But Caleb's words continued to echo in my mind, urging me forward. One Wednesday afternoon, after finishing my errands earlier than expected, I decided to stop by a small coffee shop I used to frequent before Caleb was born. It had been years since I'd set foot in the place. But as soon as I walked through the door, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods hit me, and I felt a wave of nostalgia. The cafe was quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered around the room. I ordered a cappuccino and found a seat by the window, where the sunlight streamed in, warming the worn wooden table. I pulled out my notebook again, the one I had started bringing with me everywhere, and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, haltingly. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to say. But as I sat there, sipping my coffee and letting my thoughts flow, the pages began to fill. I wrote about the park, about the way the sunlight danced on the water. I wrote about the cookies I'd baked, about how Caleb had noticed my smile. And then, without even realizing it, I started to write about Daniel. I wrote about how we met, how he'd made me laugh so effortlessly back then. I wrote about our early years together, the adventures we'd had before life became so structured, so predictable. And then, I wrote about now, about the distance that had grown between us, the unspoken tension that lingered every time he left for another business trip. By the time I looked up, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. My coffee had gone cold, and the cafe was beginning to fill with the after-work crowd. I closed my notebook, suddenly feeling exposed, as though someone might have been reading over my shoulder. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting inside me. Writing it all down had made it real, had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for far too long. That evening, as I prepared dinner, Caleb wandered into the kitchen. his nose immediately catching the scent of roasted vegetables and chicken. "Smells good," he said, leaning against the counter. "Thanks," I replied, stirring the pot on the stove. He watched me for a moment before speaking again. "You've been going out more lately." I glanced at him, surprised. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said quickly. "Not at all. It's just different. You seem happier." I smiled faintly, setting the spoon down. "I guess I am. I've been trying to, I don't know, find myself again, I suppose." Caleb nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's good, Mom. You deserve it." His words warmed me, but they also reminded me of the conversation we'd had weeks ago, the one where he'd first pointed out how distant I'd been. I wondered if he realized just how much that moment had changed me. As we ate dinner together, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Caleb had always been a good kid, kind, thoughtful, and wise beyond his years. But lately it felt like our relationship had deepened, like we were connecting on a level we never had before. Later that night, after Caleb had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the living room again, staring at the blank TV screen. My thoughts drifted to Daniel. He was due back tomorrow evening, and as much as I missed him, there was a part of me that felt apprehensive. Our conversations had become so routine, so surface level. "How was your day? How was your trip? Did Caleb finish his homework?" We talked about logistics, about schedules, but never about us. I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a real conversation, the kind that left me feeling seen and understood. I thought about the notebook, about the things I'd written in the cafe earlier that day. Part of me wanted to show it to him, to lay everything out in the open. But another part of me was terrified. What if he didn't understand? What if he didn't care? The next evening, when Daniel walked through the door, I felt a familiar mix of relief and tension. He set his suitcase down and smiled at me, his tie slightly askew. "Hey," he said, pulling me into a quick hug. "How was your week?" "It was good," I replied, stepping back. "How was yours?" "Busy as usual," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But productive." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us. Caleb came bounding down the stairs, breaking the awkwardness. "Dad," he exclaimed, wrapping his arms around Daniel. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, ruffling Caleb's hair. "How's school?" As they talked, I busied myself in the kitchen, setting the table for dinner. The conversation at the table that night was lively, mostly thanks to Caleb, who regaled us with stories about his friends and professors. Daniel laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and for a moment, it felt like old times. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. After Caleb went to bed, Daniel and I sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy. "I've been thinking," I said finally, breaking the stillness. Daniel looked at me, his expression curious. "About what?" "About us," I said, my voice quieter now. "About how things have changed." He frowned slightly, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. "I mean, we don't talk like we used to. We don't connect like we used to. It feels like we're just going through the motions." Daniel was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said finally. "I didn't either," I admitted. "Not until recently. But I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I think we've both been so focused on everything else, work, Caleb, the house, that we've forgotten about us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. I guess I just assumed everything was fine." I looked at him, my chest tight. "But it's not, Daniel. It hasn't been for a while." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," I said honestly. "But I think we need to try. For us. For Caleb." Daniel looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, vulnerability. "I want to try," he said softly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe it would take time. But at least we were finally talking. At least we were finally trying. The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. The conversation with Daniel the night before had left me feeling both hopeful and uncertain. It wasn't easy to admit how far we'd drifted apart, and even harder to acknowledge that neither of us knew exactly how to bridge the gap. But at least we'd started talking, and that felt like a step in the right direction. Daniel had already left for work by the time I came downstairs. His coffee mug sat on the counter, a small puddle of dark liquid pooling at the base. It was such a simple, ordinary thing, but for some reason it struck me. How many mornings had I cleaned up after him without a second thought? How many moments like this had passed by unnoticed, lost in the haze of routine? I wiped the counter and made myself a cup of tea, then sat at the kitchen table staring out the window. The backyard looked the same as it always did, neatly trimmed grass, the flower beds still dormant in the winter chill. But there was a heaviness in the air, a weight I couldn't quite shake. I pulled out my notebook, flipping to a blank page. Writing had become my way of sorting through the mess in my head, of untangling the knots of emotions I didn't know how to express out loud. I started jotting down thoughts, little fragments of things I'd been holding on to. Asterisk, what does it mean to start over? Can you rebuild something that's been neglected for so long? Asterisk. The pen hovered over the page as I thought about Daniel, about us, about the life we'd built together and how much of it still felt worth saving. I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to give up. Later that afternoon, Caleb came home earlier than usual. He dropped his backpack by the door, a habit I'd long since given up trying to break, and wandered into the kitchen. "Hey, Mom," he said, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "What are you up to?" "Just thinking," I said, closing my notebook and setting it aside. He raised an eyebrow. "Thinking about what?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. Caleb had always been perceptive, but I didn't want to burden him with the complexities of my relationship with Daniel. Still, he'd been the one to push me to start this journey of self-discovery, and I felt like I owed him some honesty. "About life," I said finally. "About how things change, and how we sometimes need to change with them." He took a bite of his apple, chewing thoughtfully. "Sounds deep." I laughed softly. "Maybe a little. But it's important, you know? To figure out who you are and what you want." Caleb nodded, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, I get that. I've been thinking about that a lot too, with college and everything. It's weird trying to figure out what kind of person you want to be." I smiled at him, feeling a swell of pride. "You're already a pretty great person, Caleb." He grinned. "Thanks, Mom. You're not so bad yourself." His words stayed with me long after he'd gone upstairs to his room. It was such a simple thing, but it reminded me of how much I loved being his mother. No matter what else was happening in my life, that was one thing I'd never regret. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. I was in the middle of making dinner when he walked into the kitchen, his tie loosened and his jacket slung over one arm. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hey," I replied, glancing at him over my shoulder. "You're home early." He nodded, setting his jacket on the back of a chair. "I thought maybe we could have dinner together. Just the two of us." I froze for a moment, caught off guard. It had been so long since he'd made an effort like this, and I wasn't sure how to respond. But then I saw the look in his eyes, hopeful, tentative, and I felt my heart soften. "I'd like that," I said, turning back to the stove. Caleb was out with friends that night, so it was just the two of us at the table. The meal was simple: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a salad. But it felt different somehow. There was an energy in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. We talked about small things at first: work, Caleb, the weather. But as the meal went on, the conversation began to shift. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last night," Daniel said, his voice quiet. "About how we've been going through the motions." I looked at him, my fork paused midair. And I think you're right," he admitted. "I've been so focused on work, on providing for the family, that I didn't realize how much I was neglecting us." His honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. But then I realized that this was what I'd been hoping for him to see it, to acknowledge it. "I've been neglecting us too," I said finally. "It's not just you, Daniel. We both let this happen." He nodded, his gaze steady. "So what do we do now? How do we fix it?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. "I think we start small. We make time for each other. Even if it's just a little bit each day. We talk about how we're feeling. And we try to remember why we fell in love in the first place. Daniel reached across the table, his hand covering mine. I want to try, Evelyn. I really do. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, and maybe it wouldn't happen overnight, but at least we were both willing to try. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, something we hadn't done in months. The TV was off, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. We talked about the early days of our relationship, about the trips we used to take and the dreams we'd shared. It felt like peeling back layers, rediscovering parts of ourselves that had been buried under years of routine and responsibility. By the time we went to bed, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying had been lifted. Daniel reached for my hand as we lay there in the dark, and I held on to him, feeling a sense of connection I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow over the room. Daniel was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. I watched him for a moment, feeling a strange mix of love and determination. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt and frustration. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page, like we were both willing to fight for what we had. And that, I realized, was enough. The days that followed carried a sense of renewal, as if a fresh breeze had swept through my life and Daniel's. We no longer avoided the silences between us, but instead tried to fill them with honest conversations. Whether it was small talk about work or old memories, each conversation felt like we were taking steps to rediscover each other. One Friday evening, as the three of us sat around the dinner table, Caleb suddenly looked at me and Daniel, his eyes filled with curiosity. "You two seem different," Caleb said, biting into a slice of pizza. "Like happier." Daniel and I exchanged glances, then both of us laughed. "Maybe it's because we're trying harder," Daniel said, smiling with a hint of shyness but also sincerity. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Trying harder at what?" "At getting things right," I replied, not wanting to go into too much detail, but also not wanting to hide anything. Caleb nodded, as if he understood something I didn't need to explain. "I'm glad you're doing that." "Really?" His words touched me more deeply than I expected. Sometimes I forgot that Caleb was also affected by the distance between me and Daniel. The fact that he noticed the change was a reminder that our efforts weren't just for ourselves, but for our little family as well. That weekend, Daniel suggested we go out together. Not for anything big, just a walk in the park near our house, the one we used to love visiting when Caleb was little. At first, I was surprised. Daniel wasn't usually the type to come up with ideas like that. But I agreed. And on Sunday morning, we left the house hand in hand, like a young couple newly in love. The park was just as it had always been, with tall trees and gravel paths. The laughter of children echoed from the nearby playground, and the sunlight filtered gently through the leaves, creating shimmering patterns on the ground. "Remember this spot?" Daniel asked, pointing to a wooden bench under a large tree. I smiled. "That's where you proposed to me." He nodded, his gaze distant. "I remember being so nervous I almost dropped the ring. But you said yes, and it was the happiest moment of my life." I looked at him, feeling the truth in his words. "I remember. And I was happy too." We sat down on that bench, letting time pass in peaceful silence. We didn't need many words. Just being there together was enough to fill the spaces we had once left empty. In the days that followed, Daniel and I continued to find ways to reconnect. We created no-tech evenings, where we turned off our phones and the TV and focused solely on each other. Sometimes we just talked, sometimes we played a game or looked through old photos. These seemingly simple activities brought a sense of closeness I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch reading a book, Daniel walked into the room with 2 cups of hot tea. He placed one in front of me and sat down beside me. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice low and serious. I set the book down, looking at him. "About what?" "About us. About what happened and what we're trying to do." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. I realized maybe I've been too focused on work, on providing for the family, that I didn't see how much I was neglecting us. His admission took my breath away. I had never blamed him, not once. But hearing him acknowledge it made me feel more understood than I had in years. I'm at fault too, I said, my voice trembling. I let myself drown in responsibilities and loneliness without saying anything. But I don't want that anymore, Daniel. I want us to change together. He took my hand, his gaze steady. I do too. And I promise from now on, I won't let you feel alone again. It wasn't an easy promise. I knew there would be hard days, moments when we slipped back into old habits. But I also knew that as long as we both kept trying, anything was possible. Over time, the small changes began to add up. We laughed more, talked more, and most importantly, listened to each other more. Caleb noticed it too, and our family seemed to grow closer than ever before. One spring evening, as the three of us sat on the porch watching the sunset, Caleb suddenly said, I think we're doing really well as a family. Daniel and I looked at each other, then at Caleb. You think so? I asked, smiling. Yeah, Caleb replied, his eyes sparkling. You two seem happier. And that makes me happy too. I didn't say anything, just quietly reached for Daniel's hand. In that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Life would never be perfect, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But I also knew that we had rediscovered the most important things: love, understanding, and trust in each other. And with that, I believed we could face anything together.